Good morning and good afternoon or good evening, everyone. We will start in a few minutes, so we will wait for some more people to arrive, and then we will go ahead. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm very happy to welcome you to our webinar on ambition at COP26. My name is Lien van Damme. I'm from the Center for International Environmental Law, and I will give a short introduction before I will hand the floor over to our moderator. So first of all, I want to thank everyone who is here, all the panelists who could make time in these busy times for this panel, and of course all participants who are here. The webinar is part of a series we are organizing on a briefing series on COP26, and more specifically the critical human rights issues that will be discussed at COP26. We already had a webinar on participation at COP on loss and damage, and one on Article 6. And this webinar on ambition is the fourth and last one of the series. We are recording all the webinars, and we'll share them later on with all participants. So in case you have colleagues or friends who are interested to watch it later, or you cannot attend the full webinar today, don't worry, because you will have a recording to watch. So let me first give a short introduction to why we are talking about ambition as a critical human rights issue. The warming that we are experiencing already today is leading to economic, social, cultural, and environmental consequences that have direct and indirect negative implications to the realization and to the promotion and the protection of human rights. This is especially the case for women, children, people with disabilities, indigenous peoples, local communities, people living in rural areas, and people and communities in other vulnerable situations, which is leading to an increase in global inequality. And so it's imperative that we limit warming to 1.5 degrees in order to realize, or in order to protect and promote human rights. So that's why we're talking about ambition today, but we're not only going to talk about mitigation ambition, because ambition is also about other aspects, which is why, for example, we will also talk about international climate finance. There are other commitments that have been made under the UN climate negotiations and in other fora that have also also have implications for human rights, or where the realization of these commitments could help reduce or contain the negative impacts of the climate crisis to human rights. So that's why we're talking about ambition in the broad sense today. And so that's it for my short introduction. So without further ado, I will hand it over to our moderator, Rixa Schwarz, who is the head of international climate policy at German Watch, where she oversees adaptation and resilience, but also mitigation and international partnerships. And she's also, of course, very familiar with the UN climate negotiations. So I hope you all enjoy the webinar, and Rixa, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Leanne, for kicking us off and providing the context to the webinar. It's good to see so many speakers from different sectors, from science, from policy making, and of course from civil society, and many people from the Climate Action Network family, which of course I'm also part of. What does ambition at COP26 look like? I think that's a big question. Ambition itself is a big word and a large concept. And well, if you ask me to put it in one sentence, I like to say that ambition for me is about meeting all three of the Paris goals. So looking at the 1.5 temperature limit, of course, but also looking at resilience building, as well as finance and redirecting the finance flows. And Laia had also said that we tend to look, when we talk about ambition, at mitigation first, but all the other aspects are, I would say, equally important. And of course, all of them have also implications for the human rights situation. So I'm glad we have this discussion today. I'm looking forward to all our speakers who, as I said, come from all across the world, which means for me that I will struggle a lot with all your names. So apologies up front for mispronouncing. And well, since we have a full panel and some of our panelists will also have to leave a little bit early, I think we take you one by one. And I will introduce you quickly before I hand over the word for you. And we start, as so often, with the scientific perspective. So Jean-Paul van Ipsel, I would like to hand over the word to you first. You are an academic climatologist and professor of climate and environmental sciences at the UC Lorraine. Great to have you here. We know you, or many of us know you still from your former position as the vice chair of the IPCC, where you have dealt a lot with climate change mitigation, but recently in 2019, you have also been appointed as an expert with the EU Horizon 2020 mission board for adaptation on climate change. So you also look at social transformation, and we are very keen to hear from you, setting the stage on why 1.5 is so important and what's the state of play in this regard. Over to you, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much, Rixa. It's a pleasure to be with you. Good morning or good evening, everyone, wherever you are. I will focus my introduction on the latest IPCC report, which is coming from Working Group 1. So pardon me if I don't speak too much about adaptation this morning for me at least, because I was asked to focus on the Working Group 1 latest reports. Now I'd like to go to my next slide. First, a reminder: we're really using the atmosphere as a free dustbin for greenhouse gases, and therefore I like to explain to my students that we are thickening the thermal insulation layer around the planet, and if you make that comparison, that very simple comparison, that what we are doing by injecting so many gigatons of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we are thickening a thermal insulation layer. It actually helps to understand why we need to cut emissions to net zero as soon as possible. Because as we know, when we are cold in winter, if we add a layer of clothing, we are warmer. If we add a second one, we are even warmer, etc. But at some point, if we continue to add layers, we get too warm and we suffocate. So the reason we need to get to zero is as simple as that. We need to stop the thickening of that insulation layer. And this insulation layer is thickening, as you can see here. On the left, you see the increase in the concentration of CO2 since 1850. On the right, you see the increase in temperature. We have gained almost 50% in terms of CO2 concentration over the industrial period. And we have gained a little more than 1.1 degrees C globally since the end of the 19th century. And of course, one is the cause of the other. Another way to look at the evolution of the CO2 concentration is to look at the last 10,000 years. You see that it has been very stable for almost the entire period, except the last 200 years, where really the burning of fossil fuel and deforestation have helped the concentration to shoot up. And the reason for that strong increase is, in a way, very simple. We are simply emitting about 2 times more than what the natural systems, ecosystems and the ocean can absorb. And so in a similar way to the level of water in a bathtub, well, that level is increasing. So let's focus on the latest contribution from the IPCC, the contribution from Working Group 1 to the 6th assessment report of the IPCC. It's a very solid report based on the assessment of almost 14,000 mostly peer-reviewed publications. It was the subject of 18,000 review comments written by more than 200 authors from 65 countries. So it's the most solid document on climate science you can find. And the conclusion of that document, as far as the link between the human activities and the emissions of greenhouse gases and the warming are very simple. It is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, the ocean and land. And you see the evolution over time of that diagnosis of IPCC about the link, but this conclusion now is extremely solid. It's not only the average temperature, which is increasing, it's also a number of other parameters. And those comparisons here are very striking. The CO2 concentration is the highest in at least the last 2 million years. The sea level is rising at the fastest rates in at least the last 3,000 years. The Arctic sea ice area is reaching its lowest level in at least the past 1,000 years. The glaciers are retreating in the world at a rate that is unprecedented in at least the last 2,000 years. It's also a number of extreme events which are happening either more frequently or more intensely, particularly extreme heat becoming more frequent, more intense, extreme rainfall leading very often to floods. We have seen in Europe and in many other parts of the world this summer the consequences of that for floods and for human life and ecosystems. But there are also in some parts of the world increasing droughts, increasingly favorable conditions for fires, for forest fires. We have seen that in California, in Siberia, in the southern part of Europe and other parts of the world as well. And there are consequences in the ocean as well, warming, acidifying, losses of oxygen. If we want to look at the future, of course, we have to work with scenarios, and here are the 5 key scenarios the IPCC has been looking at least for the next 100 years, from the very low with a name ending with either 1.9 or for the low scenario 2.6 to the very high scenario with a name ending with 8.5. When you feed those scenarios to the climate models, you get that those temperature increases from 1.5 above pre-industrial to almost 5 degrees for the top scenario. Actually, the very lowest scenario, the 1.9, allows the temperature to stay below 1.5, at least by the end of the century, after a slight overshoot by the middle of the century. But of course, it would require very strong political will to be implemented. We should remember that an average warming doesn't mean it will be the same everywhere. I mean, there's a spatial distribution shown here for different warming levels, showing that the continents are warming significantly more than the average and than the ocean. And also that as you get close to the Arctic, the warming is strong as well. It's also the frequency and intensity of heat extremes, as I have mentioned, which increase here. The number of dots is related to the frequency of those events. And this is for temperature. This is for heavy precipitation. You see also that with the warming, the frequency of intense precipitation is increasing. Sea level has increased by 20 centimeters also, but is due to increase even more by the end of the century, between 0.5 meter and 1 meter, depending on the scenario. By the end of the century. But a novelty of this report is that there is that dotted line here, which is a big reason for concern, because it says that for the top scenario, for the highest scenario, there's a low likelihood, but high impact, of course, possibility that sea level might increase by close to 2 meters by the end of the century and still increase significantly afterwards, because there's also a diagram in the latest IPCC report showing sea level increases until 2300. And there, as you can see, and the scale are the same. This is what we have just seen on the previous slides. For the 2.6 scenario, it's an increase between, let's say, 0.5 meter and 3 meters. For the top scenario, between 2 and 7 meters. But again, with this dotted line here and this small remark here, which I have copied here, so you can read it, sea level rise greater than 15 meters cannot be ruled out with high emissions. So if we were staying on a high emission scenario, the future of coastal regions would really be terrible, in one word. Every ton of CO2 emissions add to the global warming. This diagram has been in other forms in previous IPCC report. It's repeated that what matters is really the cumulative CO2 emissions. Small fluctuations in the CO2 emissions are not sufficient, like the one we had for after the COVID lockdowns, etc., is not sufficient to stabilize climate. Far from that. Actually, what would be needed, and this is a diagram showing coming from the IPCC special report on 1.5. As we all know, what we need is to shape the global emissions of CO2, of net CO2 emissions, when you take into account the amounts that are captured, that could be captured by either ecosystems or human, the result of human decisions. So on a net basis, we are approximately at 40 gigatons today, and we would need to have this shape of global emissions reaching approximately by 2050 zero. But some simulations suggest it might be needed to actually be net zero earlier than 2050. And also that after 2050, it's negative emissions that are needed. And actually, when you look, and this is not from the IPCC report, when you look at what happened over the last 150 years, what happened is basically an exponential growth of the emissions with some small fluctuations over time. But the trend is very clear. It's an exponential growth with 1.65% per year, unfortunately. When you look at the result of the NDCs collected before Paris, it's a positive effect. I mean, of course, it's better to be here in 2025 and here in 2030 than to stay on the business as usual trajectory. But the gap between those positions in 2025 and 2030 is very big if you compare that with the trajectory needed to be on a 1.5 scenario. I perfectly know that there was an update, but graphically the previous slide is clearer, I think. And there is some projection adaptation, some progress, at least on paper, in the update published last summer by the UNFCCC Secretariat, but we are still very far from what's needed. So we have the choice. We have the choice of being on either RCP 2.6 or even better on RCP 1.9, in which case some adaptation would still be needed, some suffering would still take place, but much less than in a world where we would basically be, as we are more or less now, on a high trajectory emissions. I am convinced, and the IPCC has repeated that many times with different words, that climate action is better integrated in the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals adopted the same year as the Paris Agreement in 2015, and that many synergies can be found if we do that at international scale. So thank you very much for your attention. I wanted to point, for those of you speaking French, that I publish with my team a newsletter, which is freely available on this website, and which helps to understand in clear language what are the latest news from the science of climate change, and I'm sorry it's only in French, but it might be of interest to you. And this is the website, the first one, where you will find my slides, the slides I've just shown you in the next 24 hours. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your input. That was indeed a good dive into the first part of the recent, or yet to be published in the next year, with the two other parts. Sixth assessment report of the IPCC. Great introduction in just so few minutes on where we stand and what we need to watch out for. I pick out the quote of yours that the 1.5 scenario actually needs very strong political will. And that is, I think, what we continue with the next inputs, looking at where our demands are and where we stand in terms of political will for ambition at this COP coming up just already by Sunday. And our next speaker is from Fiji. So good evening to Fiji. I am very happy that you are with us. You are working with PICAN, which is the Pacific Islands Climate Action Network, of course. You are there the Climate Justice Project Officer, but I would like to mention that you also are the co-founder of the Alliance for Future Generations in Fiji, that you have work experience in the field of disaster risk reduction and humanitarian action. And it is also interesting that you are as well an activist working for the Rainbow Pride Federation in Fiji, and also advocating for the rights of the LGBTQI+ community. Great to have you with us. And please do give us an overview what the Pacific climate demands for the COP are in terms of ambition.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to join you all this evening. Good evening, Bulapinaka. Good morning and good afternoon to all those who are joining in. I'd like to probably share some of the top-line messages that have come from the Pacific communities and has been part of a wide consultation. We did a consultation throughout the Pacific, and we've come out with some key top-line messages, and that was launched last week, and we will be amplifying and elevating at COP26. So, the people in the communities of the Blue Pacific are living in a climate emergency, a crisis that sadly continues to be ignored by many countries, including those nearest to our islands. The Pacific is also leading the charge using our own Pacific cultures, tradition, and wisdom of ecological and social stewardship to bring us through the current global climate catastrophe. And we are committed to a climate stable Pacific future that is unified, intersectional, and intergenerational. So in the lead up to next week's COP26, the wider Pacific communities are demanding climate justice and climate action now. We are demanding that the global community to act to close, the emissions gap. Fossil fuels are fossils, and you need to keep them in the ground to save the Pacific. We demand no new coal, oil, or gas projects, an immediate end to all fossil fuel subsidies everywhere. We also demand that you show real commitment, and your NDCs must limit global heating to 1.5 degrees. And we are already out of time here in the islands. Sustained, radical, and socially just cuts to emissions are required now, not later. Net zero emissions that are predicated on unspecified technology breakthrough is not a real solution. We need to address this issue at its roots, and for the Pacific, especially atoll island nations, some of which are just 2 to 3 meters above sea level, we don't have 20 or 30 more years. We're calling on the global community that we need to hold the line on 1.5 degrees. The Pacific also demands that you show us the money. Developed countries who have promised to mobilize US $100 billion annually until 2025 have failed to deliver that since 2020. And we are calling on them to deliver that. And we agree that polluters must pay the trillions that's actually needed for resilient Pacific peoples and communities. From COP26, we are hoping that parties must concretely and comprehensively engage at COP26 to achieve a new global goal on climate finance that will take effect from 2026. And the new global goal must have a minimum floor of US $750 billion annually mobilized by developed countries for developing countries. We are witnesses to loss and damage is a matter of life and death here in the Pacific. Your political will is required now to finance and deliver support for Pacific people who are losing everything. We are calling on parties to operationalize the Santiago network on loss and damage, make loss and damage a permanent agenda item of the UNFCCC, and call on parties to establish a finance mechanism for loss and damage that is separate from adaptation finance. We declare that climate change is a symptom of a deeper injustice and inequalities. Therefore, gender justice and women's human rights and empowerment should be and must be a precondition for climate, social, economic, ecological, and climate justice. We assert that climate justice will prevail. Your emissions are already responsible for the loss of universal human rights and environmental rights for Pacific people, communities, and ecosystems. We will see you in the courts of law and in all other forums to protect and retain our rights. Finally, the Pacific demands that the global climate negotiations at COP26 must be inclusive, intersectional, equitable, and intergenerational. Do not marginalize the voices of Pacific Island people at COP26. Thank you, and Vinakamakalevu.
Thank you very much for that strong message, and also for widening the context a little bit more, and bringing also the term of loss and damage clearly onto the agenda. I think it is one of our key asks for the COP as the CAN family, and it's great to include that in the ambition discussion as well. Thank you very much for that. As all our speakers who are now with us online will remain also with us, please use the chat function to formulate your questions for the discussion later on. While we now move on to the next speaker, who is Mariana Torfgard from the Climate Action Network International. Good to have you with us. You carry the lovely title of being the head of climate ambition and action at CANI, and well, you have plenty of years of experience in international policy, environmental and climate change issues, including the UNFCCC negotiations, where of course you also know each other from great to have you with us. And please, Mariana, do let us know what civil society and can actually ask for in terms of ambition at COP26 and what that means.
Thank you. Thank you, Rixa, and thank you, Ciel, for organizing this webinar. And happy to talk a little bit more about the mitigation ambition part of our expectations towards COP26. And obviously, I think as the previous two speakers, outlined, it is crucial to have an outcome from the COP that that brings across the willingness and the political will and the determination of countries to actually work on staying below 1.5 degrees. And here, I think from the COP outcomes, we are pushing for a couple of things to be featuring in a decision from the COP. And that would be, first of all, a very strong reference to the 1.5 goal, temperature goal. As many of you will know, there are the original goal is, keeping temperatures below 2 degrees towards 1.5, and we do think that the science shows the urgency and the importance of staying below 1.5 degrees. And I think for some countries, including, Fiji, 1.5 is already a compromise, whereas, we still need to see that squarely in a COP decision that countries are actually acknowledging the science and acknowledging that the 1.5 target is important to keep. And for that, the next point we want to see is, of course, this point of the country targets and the national contributions, the NDCs, as also alluded to in the previous presentation. Countries are not there yet on a global scale. We are not on a 1.5 degrees pathway. We're currently on a 2.7 degrees pathway, and we need to do more. Countries need to do more. So there is a need to state that at the COP as well, and commit to annually ratcheting up their ambition by producing annual NDC updates. In the Paris Agreement, originally, countries committed to 5-year updates, but the recent period has shown that, that mechanism is not working to the extent that we need. And now we are at a point where we actually need annual updates in order to come back to, or to be on a 1.5 degrees pathway. So annual NDC updates is what is needed until we are on that pathway. And for us to be able to assess whether we are actually on that pathway, we would also be asking for annual synthesis reports. It was briefly mentioned by Mr. van Ipselen that the UNFCCC has recently produced a report looking at the global aggregate effect of the national climate policies and targets. And we would want that to happen every year, that the UNFCCC Secretariat produces such a report so that we can assess whether we are on the path or not. And then obviously countries also need to have a space and a forum where they can discuss the status. So we would want to also see an agenda item each year for the COP, where countries would be discussing the mitigation ambition and where we are at and what more needs to happen. So those are the sort of technical asks that we would want to see reflected in a COP decision. As you said, I'm also looking at climate action. And I think when we meet at the COPs, we're very focused on policy, and we're very focused on international cooperation, and obviously also what individual countries are doing. However, the action point also needs to be reflected, and countries need to accelerate the implementation of their policies on the national level, and that also needs to come through. And here I think one good way of doing that is by referencing also where the problem is, or the source of the problem, which is fossil fuels, as the previous speaker also mentioned. There needs to be a commitment and an acknowledgement of that fossil fuels need to be phased out. So we would also like to see that coming out of the COP. So far, I think governments have, in the negotiations, stepped back from having that discussion and focus it instead on climate policy. But it's now time to also mention that fossil fuels need to be phased out and to have that reflected in the COP outcomes. And then one final point, as we here as civil society, and as we are looking at a social transformation, even though we're talking about technologies and we're talking about targets and numbers, in the end this comes down to our societies having to transform on a national and on a local level. And for that, civil society and organizations and community-based organizations also need to be included in the national review processes of the national climate policies. That is crucially important, so that those policies can actually be implemented in a good and effective way, and with the engagement and cooperation of organizations that are present on the local level. So that would also be important for us, to not only talk about what governments and parties are doing, but also to include, all the partners that are actually part of achieving transformed societies. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Rixa.
Thank you very much, Marianne, for that. Good to hear, and with more in detail on the mitigation expectation on ambition at the COP. I would now like to hand over the word to Selama Witt-Dester-Rubbet, who is the program coordinator at the Climate Vulnerable Forum, CVF, which also came out recently with exactly the demand of an annual ambition moment for ambition increase. And it is very interesting to hear from you how we could take this suggestion forward. It is rather new. And yeah, what does ambition at COP26 actually mean for the CVF? Please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rika. You can hear me, right? Okay, great. Just to say a few words first about the Climate Vulnerable Forum. It's a forum of countries that are extremely vulnerable to climate change and also do not have the economic capacity to combat climate change. We have 48 countries that are member to it, but with the recent summit that we're going to have on the 2nd of November, we would expect to have more countries, as so many countries have asked to join the forum as well. The forum started in 2009 by the then president in Maldives, and currently it is being chaired by Bangladesh. With this, I want to touch on not only the aspect of the annual raising platform, but a part of that is what we have as COP26 is a climate emergency pact. So in that pact, it has two pillars. One pillar is one that touches on climate finance and how that finance needs to be disseminated 50% to adaptation and 50% to mitigation. And the second pillar is this annual ambition raising platform. So the reason we want to address this as a pact is that quite often we either discuss separately on adaptation or we make discussions separately on mitigation. And within this process, this has created a lack of trust. So we wanted to come up with a pact that would address all of the concerns, and this includes financing for both adaptation and mitigation, and also making sure that we stay within 1.5 degree. So to that effect, we are now proposing that there should be a predictable financing for the year from the year 2021 to 2024 till we start on the new financing goals. And we're also seeking a support from IMF to make sure that this is being made available, and that this is 50% allocated to adaptation and 50% allocated to mitigation. In addition to that, when we look into the ambition platform, what we are asking is for especially big emitter countries to communicate their ambitious goals for mitigation every year. And this is, I mean, I wouldn't want to get to the details of the IPCC because we did heard in a good way from that. So this is coming from the IPCC report, where it was clearly informed that if we are to achieve 1.5, the coming 5 years are essential. So what we are coming up with is making sure that starting from the next COP, but with this COP, we expect to have a decision that would create the platform for annual ambition raising. And then starting from next COP, we would want countries to communicate. And this has to be in addition to the NDCs that have been communicated. So quite often we're hearing, what about common time frame? What about global stock take? So, but like, why is it that we're focusing in this 5 years period? So we know within the Paris Agreement, we have the NDCs, we have other platforms where we can check if we have made the progress we do want to make. We're going to start with the global stock take as well. But this processes usually are every 5 years. And if we are looking at the report from the UNFCCC Secretariat, and if we're also trying to address making sure that 1.5 is still feasible, we can't continue with the way we are doing things currently, which is waiting for the next 5-year cycle of NDCs and then waiting for the global stock take. So by those period, we would lose the window of maintaining 1.5. So this is why we want to suggest, starting from COP27, that there should be a platform for countries to come in and say, in addition to what has been communicated in our NDCs, we would also like to highlight that that we would be doing this and that additional act for this year. So this is to make sure, and we're asking this for a 5 years period. And in the meantime, this would definitely be informed by the global stock take. And hopefully by then we would reach, by this COP, we would reach an agreement on common timeframes, which would also be very helpful in supporting the ambition cycle. But the main priority is making sure every year parties would come and they would have a platform where they would say, we're doing this and that to increase our ambition. And we're hoping by this COP that we will get a decision that will lead us in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much for explaining a little bit more detailed this very exciting suggestion, actually, of the annual NDC upgrade enhancement. I forgot to mention that you are also an environmental law expert who is also negotiating for the Ministry of Environment and Forest in Ethiopia. And it will be exciting to see how you are negotiating at COP26 for this kind of a step for ambition increase. I could imagine that we will have further questions for you later on. But as you also spoke about finance already, let us move on to our next speaker, who is Leia Achampong, the Senior Policy and Advocacy Officer at Eurodat. Great to have you with us today. You are going to look, of course, at the state of finance, so as the so-called other ambition gap in the context of 26. And you have been working with many different agencies, including WWF and the Climate Action Network Europe before, looking at various issues, and I think that's a good ground to explain us where we stand on finance ambition and what actually needs to happen at the COP in order to close the gap or bring us on a trajectory to closing this gap. Thanks for being with us also, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rixa. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this webinar on ambition. As we've heard, there are the good outcomes at COP26 are twofold. It's about ensuring that climate ambition is high and recurring, but also that the climate finance gap is closed. If you could move to the next slide, please. Those most impacted by climate change have historically contributed the least to climate change and have also struggled to effectively contribute to this global effort to address climate change. This is in part due to a lack of financial and technical resources, but also in part caused by ever-mounting debt levels. And repaying those outstanding debts and financing climate action is becoming increasingly difficult for countries to bear, all of which is stopping effective climate action from taking place and is making it harder for the goals of the Paris Agreement and sustainable development to be achieved. So COP26 will not be a success unless there is also scaled up climate finance committed. Next slide, please. So the current climate finance goal is for 100 billion USD per year, and that goal was meant to be met in 2020. At COP21 in 2015, that goal was extended until 2025, and with an aim of a new global climate finance goal being set by 2025, and those discussions will start at COP26 this November. Current estimates of climate financing needs for mitigation alone range between 1.6 trillion to 3.8 trillion annually between 2016 and 2050, and yet the existing global climate financing gap continues. Next slide, please. So where do things stand on climate finance? The OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, they produce a now annual report on climate finance trends. And for 2019, the data is not what we want to be seeing, but it highlights some very worrying trends. Total public climate finance in 2019 amounted to $79.6 billion US. That's 20.4 billion less than the yearly goal that developed countries are supposed to achieve. Whilst total adaptation finance grew in 2019 by 20% to 20.1 billion, total mitigation finance still accounts for 2/3 of total public climate finance, which highlights the continued lack of balance between mitigation and adaptation finance, and is obviously not in line with the goals that are being highlighted by country groupings like the Climate Vulnerable Forum or the African Group of Negotiators. Public grants financing stood at 27% in 2019, amounting to 16.7 billion USD. Whilst this is the first significant increase in public financing grants in 3 years, it is still too little. And this is in comparison to public loans in 2019, both concessional and non-concessional loans, which accounted for a staggering 71% of climate finance in 2019. Developed countries are still using this debt-generating instrument of loans far too much. Additionally, bilateral climate finance fell to 28.8 billion USD in 2019. And this is despite the UNFCCC Convention, Articles 4.3 and 4.4, stating that it's the responsibility of developed countries to provide predictable streams of finance to support developing countries in a manner that supports their continued sustainable and economic development. Building trust and belief in the process means that rich nations cannot outsource their responsibility to repay the climate debt of historically having polluted the most. What's more, this graph from recently published in Eurodad publication shows that approximately 70 times more finance has gone to fossil fuels through G20 countries as international public finance institutions in a 5-year period than in the entire 20-year history of the Adaptation Fund, which highlights how severely underfunded adaptation measures are. fossil fuel financing activities go against the Paris Agreement and SDG 12.C on rationalizing inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that encourage wasteful consumption. Whilst there have been a number of notable announcements on ending international fossil fuel finance from e.g. the USA, the UK, the European Investment Bank, and most recently the OECD Development Assistance Committee members, fossil fuel finance is an ongoing issue. On Monday, the 25th, some of you may know that the Climate Finance Delivery Plan was published. It was a much anticipated plan outlining how rich nations will meet the 100 billion goal. The plan was one of the key follow-up outcomes of the 2021 July COP ministerial, but it's been a huge disappointment. Some of the key takeaways from the plan include that it will take up until 2023 to achieve the 100 billion climate finance goal. That's 3 years past the goal date. And these projections are also at odds with the UNFCCC synthesis report on NDCs, which also came out on Monday, which Marianne also highlighted. The synthesis report highlights that developing nations say that they can carry out a lot more with enhanced financial resources, technology transfer, and capacity building. But without additional climate finance, they cannot do as much. The differences between the synthesis report's findings and the Climate Finance Delivery Plan's projections highlight yet again that there's a difference between what developed countries prioritize on climate finance and the needs of developing countries. The projections in the Climate Finance Delivery Plan also show that climate finance levels in 2024 and 2025 will surpass 100 billion annually, but this is nowhere near the climate finance levels needed, and it's not clear that that finance for the period will be new and additional, particularly not when ahead of COP26, African governments have already called for 1.3 trillion USD by 2030. Whilst the projections in the Climate Finance Delivery Plan are only until 2025, the pace outlined in the plan shows that developed countries are nowhere near meeting 1.3 trillion by 2030. These projections are additionally worrying because trends show that in the last 5 years, there's been a rise in households personally paying for the cost of addressing climate change. Households and individuals were the second largest source of private investment in 2017-2018 climate finance flow period. It's local people and communities who are most at risk of climate impacts who are paying for climate adaptation measures and to address their climate impacts. And that's in part due to a lack of access to climate finance at a local community level to address the impacts they're experiencing. So there must be greater local level access to climate finance. On top of all of this, data from Aid Atlas shows that only 60.4% of climate-related development finance was dispersed between 2002 and 2018. Whilst it's not clear how far this trend on climate-related development finance applies to pure climate finance flows, it is still a very, very worrying trend. So what needs to happen at COP26 to close the gap? The next 5 years must mark a new chapter in climate finance by prioritizing financial grants, providing finance to address losses and damages, increasing adaptation finance, and ensuring genuine access to climate finance. And above all, finance must be gender responsive. Specifically, there must be new and additional climate finance being provided to achieve the current goal, which is currently insufficient and needs to be surpassed. With regards to the setting of a new global climate finance goal for the post-2025 period, the focus of those discussions will be on setting out a process for agreeing the goal. But the process needs to also take into account lessons learned on the pre-2020 climate finance period and include clear milestones for achieving the global climate finance goal ahead of 2025 and beyond 2025. Additionally, we must ensure that debt doesn't prevail during a climate disaster, and in the immediate aftermath of climate disasters, developed countries must agree on an automatic mechanism to suspend debt payments that is in addition to providing climate finance. And to be effective, the scope of the debt cancellation must cover both private and official creditors. countries must start providing climate finance in the form of non-debt generating finance instruments so as not to worsen debt vulnerabilities in countries in the global south. And unconditional debt cancellation should be granted to all countries in need of it and to all countries that have unsustainable and illegitimate debt, particularly debt generated by fossil fuel projects. Countries must support greater access to finance for women and indigenous communities. And a gender analysis must be conducted to determine the differing needs and interests and accessibility to finance mechanisms, as well as the power dynamics of different communities of different marginalized communities. A share of proceeds for the Adaptation Fund must be provided, but adaptation finance needs to be drastically scaled up to ensure that vulnerable communities are able to carry out much needed adaptation measures. And to conclude, underpinning all of this, there must be a robust transparency framework covering all climate finance providers, including multilateral development banks and private finance stakeholders, in order to track additionality. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'm happy to answer questions during the Q&A session.
Yes, thank you very much, Leah, for reminding us also that the finance gap actually does not only refer to the promised 100 billion per year, but more than that to the actual need, especially in terms of adaptation funding and loss and damage finance. Hot topics definitely for the COP. Thanks for the introduction and also to drawing the linkages to related negotiating items of transparency and Article 6. With this, I would like to then invite our last speaker, who is Tom Evans of E3G, a researcher there looking at topics of geopolitics, climate diplomacy, and security, and with that probably perfectly equipped of drawing conclusions and framing ambitions also beyond mitigations from what we have heard so far as inputs, and having a look at how COP26 can make up for maybe several missed opportunities earlier in the negotiations, and what does ambition at COP26 mean beyond mitigation. Over to you, Tom.
Thanks very much. And thanks to all the other panelists who have been so very detailed and actually covered lots on ambition beyond mitigation. So I think makes my job slightly easier. Rixa, you opened with, talking about ambition has to be in all senses and across all dimensions of the Paris Agreement, not just mitigation. And that's 100% true. I couldn't agree more. Mitigation is far from the only issue on the table at COP26, as many of the other speakers have pointed out. I think the key thing across all of it is that we need COP26 to be a moment of acceleration, and it has to be a moment where we accelerate action in the 2020s. I think all of the gaps and all of the concerns other speakers have pointed to shows that really this decade is the one that's going to be pivotal to actually implementing the goals of the Paris Agreement, whether that's on the finance needed to achieve our adaptation goals or our Paris temperature goals, or whether it's on loss and damage, which has seen very little action. I think I'd just like to kind of briefly in my remarks touch on 5 different areas beyond mitigation: sectoral transformation, the finance, adaptation, loss and damage, and the Paris rulebook. And I think all of those areas alongside mitigation can then form this kind of overall Glasgow package of acceleration in the 2020s if we get high ambition outcomes in each of these areas. Starting with sectoral transformation, I think this is a really key, pillar of action. And by that I mean it's real economy action on actually changing, the energy systems we use, or the nature of our transport, or how we interact with nature. Fossil fuel phase out's been mentioned as a key area of action, and specifically here, I think highlighting coal, and obviously COP26 has been flagged as a place that could be the moment to consign coal to history. And I think that really has to happen to give the sense of accelerating action on eliminating fossil fuels, and specifically, new fresh commitments to no new coal power commitments for phase out of coal in the 2030s in OECD countries and 2040s in non-OECD countries, in line with what the IEA reports said on net zero trajectories to be aligned with 1.5, especially as well on fossil fuel finance. And we know, the UK has announced that they're going to be forming a bit of a statement of kind of first movers around committing to end fossil fuel finance overseas. And that's a really great kind of first start. We have a long way to go to actually make that true domestically, to actually tackle those fossil fuel subsidies, which are so, grossly distorting the global economic system. But all of those, I think, can help accelerate the sense that we're really pushing much further and faster to kick out fossil fuels from the system. Likewise, in transport, we really need to see phase out of internal combustion engines in 80% of global markets by about 2035, again, in line with what the IEA and what other institutions are saying would be needed to actually make a net zero transition at the pace and scale required. And again, nature is a really important part of this. How can we actually make sure that our global economies are using nature to actually implement 1.5? Nature is crucial to the 1.5 goal. We cannot reach it without actually making sure that we're preserving nature and making sure that carbon sinks are restored and protected. And in that sense, much stronger commitments on deforestation and actually the sustainability of supply chains will be critical. So I think that kind of all of that sectoral transformation stuff can really help build confidence that we're moving at the pace required, and that actually it kind of lays great foundations for countries' ambitions to be raised even further in the 2020s. And countries lag behind the real economy change. We saw, since the Paris Agreement's been signed, how quickly the price of clean energy technologies has descended. And actually, the real economy definitely leads some of this change, and countries lag it. So hopefully providing that foundation can build more ambition in the 2020s. I won't say too much about the second pillar, finance, because I think that's been covered in lots of depth by Leah just then. But I think really that critical point of how do we actually address, not just the billions, but the trillions needed to unlock this climate transition. And that's going to take a very different approach to global investment in infrastructure that's been done before. I think of something like, the G7 countries announced that they wanted to start this kind of Build Back Better World initiative, this clean and green initiative to focus, major investment in infrastructure in developing countries. That's the sort of platform that could really unlock higher ambition in middle income countries and developing countries. But right now it doesn't have any financial firepower behind it. It's just an idea, but there's no money on the table. And leaders really stepping up to put their money into these infrastructure packages is absolutely key, not just for something like the G7's initiative, but also putting pressure on things like China's Belt and Road Initiative and making them use their hundreds of billions in overseas investment to make sure that that's actually aligned with the Paris Agreement and not investing in fossil fuels. The third pillar is adaptation. I think adaptation has also been touched on by many other speakers, so I won't go into tons of detail. But it goes without saying that the gap on adaptation is absolutely stark. The amount of finance going into adaptation today just completely being dwarfed by that going to mitigation or that going to fossil fuels more broadly. And closing this kind of adaptation finance gap will be really, really critical. I think, as Leah mentioned, that kind of 50% of climate finance going to adaptation will be really key to actually fulfilling, the Paris Agreement language around mitigation and adaptation finance being balanced. But also, as mentioned by the speakers, we need more grant finance. We need more highly concessional financing for adaptation to make sure this doesn't exacerbate existing debt burdens in developing countries. And I think there's also a piece around operationalizing the global goal on adaptation. And this is something that's, very firmly within the kind of UNFCCC negotiations. It seems very technical, but actually making sure we have the means to measure and assess progress towards adaptation, which is so complex and just not the same as easily measuring gigatons emissions reductions. How do you define adaptation in a way that really assesses that progress properly? And a popular idea out there, which I think is definitely worth exploring, what COP is, mandating the IPCC to take some of that legwork and really come up with the metrics and the means to be able to assess progress for the global goal on adaptation. The fourth pillar is loss and damage. And obviously, this is an area which has seen so little action almost basically no action since the Paris Agreement was signed agreed in 2015. COP26 absolutely has to be that moment where we see a change at last in countries finally wanting to take much more action on loss and damage. I think former speakers mentioned the operationalization of the Santiago network, actually making that a really equipped network that can properly deal with the issues of loss and damage. But also, as Cannes said, Climate Action Networks put loss and damage finance as one of their key issues at COP26, and making that a real priority issue that we need to see, not just networks and support, but real, again, cash on the table to unlock action, because we know that the need is so great. And then I guess, other ideas on the table include a standing agenda item to discuss loss and damage permanently, and even, a special envoy for loss and damage to have the political convening to actually bring political attention to this issue in the years going forward. And I think all of those ideas are, full of merit and should be considered as we approach COP26. I think the fifth and final kind of pillar is this Paris rulebook. And I don't think the Paris rulebook necessarily gets you tons of acceleration of action in the 2020s, but I think there's lots of risks around not being able to accelerate if you don't get high ambition, high integrity rules. So on common timeframes for NDCs, we definitely need 5-year timeframes. If we have 10-year timeframes, which end up delaying the timeframes in which countries submit their next climate targets, we're going to lose precious time to be able to increase ambition. So 5-year targets really will be, 5-year common timeframes really will be critical. Likewise with transparency, we need, high integrity rules, as well as flexibility to support implementation of those transparency regulations, but really making sure that we have the scrutiny provided to make sure that ambition can be delivered in the 2020s. And if we don't get those high integrity rules, it's going to really hamper our ability, especially as civil society, to hold government's feet to the fire. And likewise with Article 6, I think there's lots of debate about what role carbon markets have in the global economy, and as we transition to a net zero future. But we do know that weak Article 6 rules could completely undermine the Paris Agreement. It's a huge risk in terms of the carryover of, for example, the carryover of Kyoto Protocol era units, if done badly, could almost wipe out all of the gains that we've had from NDCs submitted so far, for instance. So, the risks are real, the risks are there. We need high ambition, high integrity rules to make sure that we don't undermine the Paris Agreement. And I think if we get all of those things across those 5 pillars, so across adaptation, loss and damage, finance, the Paris rulebook, sectoral transformation, and on mitigation, as other speakers have outlined, that would be a really comprehensive package at Glasgow that could, credibly say we've started to accelerate action in the 2020s to close all of the gaps to meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. And I think it's really important that we do see all of that as a package. We can't make progress on loss and damage without actually taking much more action on mitigation, because the two are so heavily interlinked. And that's not just because of the politics of it. And you're not going to be able to land a high ambition outcome on mitigation if you don't address the concerns of vulnerable countries on loss and damage. It's just politically not feasible. I think it's also important to emphasize that the key to landing some of these high ambition packages is that we need a really solid alliance between those countries, especially developed countries, who are pushing for these progressive outcomes, and climate vulnerable countries who have been campaigning for this for so hard for so long. Only then, if we kind of build those alliances, can we really make sure that some of the blockers, the likes of Brazil and Saudi Arabia, are really isolated and not able to disrupt a high ambition package being landed at Glasgow. So I think there's good political reason for uniting this as a package. But there's also fundamentally, it goes back to the science and what we heard from Jean-Pascal at the beginning. If we don't have acceleration outcomes on all of those areas, we're not actually adequately responding to that code red warning that the IPCC issued earlier this year in their assessment report. It's absolutely needed by the science, and hopefully that's what COP26 can deliver. So I'll leave my remarks there and look forward to the panel discussion. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Tom, for giving us an overview of the different bits and pieces and how they need to come together for the high ambition package of the COP that we all seek to see in the end of those intense 2 weeks in front of us. Also, thanks again for reminding us that ambition does not mean a little bit more here and there, but that it actually means transition. I liked a lot how you framed the sectoral transformation and the pieces that we actually expect next to the negotiations out of COP26 also. And I think for the flow of the COP that we are going to see, it is interesting to see that we have there 3 spheres maybe for ambition also. We start the COP, of course, with the Leader Summit in the first 2 days of November, where we can see if we actually get additional announcements of NDCs or LTS, finance, or other sectors, but also the tone setting for how ambitious we actually want to negotiate at the COP. Then, of course, we have the 2 weeks of negotiations, and we touched even also on bits and pieces of transparency, Article 6, loss and damage, adaptation, the whole ambition set, and so on. And then, of course, we have these theme days that the UK also set on the agenda, where we hopefully expect on many different sectors announcement by countries, by country groups, but also from non-state actors that can drive the agenda forward and underpin really the targets set by countries and help towards the implementation, because after all, implementation really is what we need. So thanks a lot again to all the speakers. We have now reached the point where we would open the floor for questions. Correct me, Leanne, if I'm wrong, but so far I have not seen any questions coming in. So I would then like to open the floor and talk a little bit or ask the panelists about different countries, because all your inputs have been very much to the COP26 agenda and what we expect of the negotiations. But are there different countries from whom we would actually expect a step forward announcement in different terms of NDCs or LTS, or announcements like Tom already mentioned within the coal phase out or the fossil fuel financing phase out? Whom are we actually looking for to drive the ambition, and maybe even setting the tone in the very early days of the COP? Is any of you willing to hop in and seeing who we actually should have a closer look at in the country setup? Mariana, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Rix. And actually, after I gave my presentation, I thought, I forgot to mention one point. And that is, of course, that for us, it is crucially important that the major emitters take a lead in reducing their emissions. And, this comes down to also the G20 countries meeting just before the COP. And we do expect the G20 countries to be very clear on that they will phase out fossil fuels and fossil fuel subsidies, and that they will take the lead in actually reducing their emissions according to their fair share and their historic responsibility. And I see a couple of other hands have gone up, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Okay, I will just take you one after the other, and I've seen that now also further questions came in, but let's stick to this one first. So Leah and then Tom, please.
Thank you. I'll be brief, but I think this year we saw that the United States of America came back to the Paris Agreement, and that means that they've also come back to the climate financing table. And we saw at the US Climate Leaders Summit that they made a number of announcements. However, something that's been made clear is that their adaptation finance did not go up as significantly as we would want to see. So it was announced that the US would be tripling its adaptation finance, which sounds impressive until you realize that the initial amount that they're tripling from is incredibly small. So something that we would like to see is for adaptation finance from all of the largest emitters to significantly increase, and for a commitment for the largest emitters to provide finance to address loss and damage, and that the priority should be, in terms of adaptation and loss and damage finance, the priority should be for these funds to be provided in the form of grants or debt cancellation to ensure that we're not further adding to a country's debt levels. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Tom, please take over.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I'll be quick as well and just say that I completely agree that the G20 will be really key, and obviously they're meeting just before COP starts, and I think we'll be really looking for a strong signal from the G20 on that willingness for COP to be a place where we can start talking about those acceleration packages. And, you know, especially on the mitigation front, the strong hooks we need in the communique on 1.5, on net zero, on NDCs. I think it's worth emphasizing as well, you know, back in July, the G20 ministerial, the climate ministerial agreed that all G20 countries would bring new NDCs before COP, and that hasn't happened. And, you know, we haven't had them from China or India or Saudi Arabia. Australia has an NDC, but it's worthless because it's not aligned to net zero. It's a very weak NDC. Likewise with places like Brazil and Russia. So there's huge kind of gaps on specific countries, and they need to be able to actually admit that and you know, put their hands up and say it's not enough, and then actually then say, you know, what can we do to make sure that it will be enough in, you know, next year and the year after and every year until that gap's closed. Yeah, I'll leave it there, but I think, you know, watching those G20 big major emitters, as Marianne said, will be really key.
Absolutely, and it's interesting to have the G20 summit right before the COP, so it could actually contribute to the tone setting as well, if they wanted so. Selamawit, you also wanted to add.
I would concur with what was said earlier, and I really hope that we get some positive messaging from the G20, because it would be very helpful in setting the tone for the COP, but especially looking at to mitigation. If we are to maintain 1.5, we would have to target the high emitting countries. Not only that, it has to be linked to the fact that targeting them not only for emissions, but also targeting those countries that should comply with their financial goals, because we're not failing not only on mitigation, but the more we fail on the finance side, we're also failing for adaptation. Again, that is another failure on loss and damage. So it would come back to the G20 countries and those countries that have made pledges. But there is also one thing that I want to highlight whenever we talk about the 100 billion goal, is that so far we've been talking about the 100 billion goal that should have been achieved ages ago. And now we've reached the second phase where we're supposed to have, in this 5 years gap, we're supposed to have the 500 billion goal. And we've been constant, when we constantly mention 100 billion, we sort of fail to see the bigger picture, because I think from now on we should not just be talking about 100 billion, but we should be talking about what we should expect by the end of 2024. And with the recent report saying that the 100 billion we've been talking about for ages would be fulfilled 2 years after, what does that then say about the 100 billion we were supposed to expect annually? So I think within the climate community as well, when we talk about the finance target, we need to change our language, because after 5 years, we shouldn't be saying 100 billion. It should be the aggregate that we should be talking about. So I think there also needs to be a change in the tone we speak of when we speak on climate finance. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for making that clear again. And I think what was mentioned earlier also, the needs-based assessment of what finance actually should be about is quite important for really shifting that tone as well. We have in the meantime received a question from the audience, which is in regard to fossil fuels, which we mentioned several times already. The question is how fossil fuels can be addressed in the negotiations specifically, and what our expectations are on concrete outcomes for COP26 in this regard. Who would like to take this question? Yes, please.
Thank you. Throughout this year, we've been having regional dialogues, and one of the things that came out strongly is in making sure that there shouldn't be any new financing for coal. So as a start, not only are we asking to gradually shift from the use of coal, but also we want to work with the finance mechanisms where there shouldn't be any sort of financing for a new coal program. So these are one of the things that we're asking for, and we're hoping that this would be concurred by also so many other countries if we are to meet the target. So the start would be to make sure that there wouldn't be at least no new financing while we gradually also move to renewable energy, and also making sure that this is disseminated throughout developing countries.
Thank you. Are there additions from anyone? All right.
I think I can quickly just say that, you know, I mean, I think it would be great. I think the high ambition outcome would be to have, you know, clear language in a COP decision text around fossil fuels and making some of that, you know, codified in the UNFCCC space. But as far as I know, you know, I don't think that's ever been achieved, and it's a really, really difficult issue because of all the fossil fuel interests that countries bring to those talks. So I think if it doesn't happen, I don't think that should ever stop our, you know, campaign to make that happen. And I think it's really important to emphasize all of the kind of outside the UNFCCC space action that is happening to kick out fossil fuels. And we have things like the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance being led by Denmark and Costa Rica to try and, you know, be a first movers group on phasing out fossil fuel production. We have this kind of UK-led initiative on fossil fuel finance. We have you know, compacts at COP on no new coal, on hopefully a G20 commitment on lending coal finance. It's about kind of trying to get fossil fuel action everywhere in every space and in as many places as possible, because, you know, it shouldn't just be in the UNFCCC COP decision text. It would be great if that could happen, but we just know how hard that is. But yeah, keen for other panelists' thoughts too. Thanks.
Yes, thanks, Tom. Mariana, and then Leah.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, maybe just jumping off where Tom left, you know, the initiatives that are out there, you know, raise our hope that actually we could have a reference to fossil fuel phase out in the COP decision. But obviously, I mean, the way the process works at the moment is, you know, there are consultations being held by the Minister of Denmark and the Minister of Grenada with countries around what should be in that COP decision. And, you know, whereas we are pressuring a lot from the outside, and where we also see a lot of momentum building around fossil fuel phase out, also with the statements from the UN Secretary General, etc., we also need parties or countries to actually mention this during consultations. And I think there's a barrier to do that still, and, you know, but we're happy to work with countries on how could that be formulated, how could that be brought to the table so that we actually have it in a COP decision, because that is how you eventually get text in, and countries and parties hopefully will feel their back strengthened, bringing in that reference by all the outside movement that is on this issue.
Leah, please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to flag that under the UNFCCC, there is a work stream on response measures. And within the context of that, we see some countries pushing for the role of, for sort of support in transitioning away from fossil fuels. That work stream has been heavily dominated by fossil fuel generating countries such as Saudi Arabia, but I see that there's an opportunity there for fossil fuel generating countries from the global south to be able to have discussions around economic diversification of their economies, and so perhaps within there, that's an opportunity to get strong language on fossil fuel subsidy reform and economic diversification away from fossil fuels, as well as ensuring that there's a just transition for the fossil fuel community in developing countries. It's been dominated a lot by countries like Saudi Arabia, but now is a good opportunity to push for that work stream to be better represented on our fossil fuel asks.
Thank you for this. There is another question from the audience in regard to where the discussions stand on realizing innovative sources for climate finance, for example, the levy on fossil fuel production, and whether this is also part of the agenda of COP26. Laia, your hand is still up, and I think the finance question is good in your hands. So if you want, go ahead.
Yeah, I can come in on this. I think that's it's a really interesting debate. So I think that there are some countries that are more open to different types of innovative sources of climate finance. So for instance, debt cancellation is something that is being termed as an innovative source of climate finance. And what we've seen is that you have countries like Bangladesh that have been calling for the debt and climate finance dynamics to be reflected upon better within the negotiations. You also have the small island developing states as well. But with regards to a fossil fuel levy, you have there's some pushback from some of the European countries against this because of the role that that fossil fuels play within those types of economies. You have Germany, which is a coal has a coal economy and is looking to phase out coal within the country, I think by 2035 or 2038, but that's still up in the air with regards to the new possible coalition government there. And those types of countries are not as open to a fossil fuel levy. I think in the context at COP26, there will also be a review of the financial mechanisms that serve the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, namely the Green Climate Fund and the Global Environment Fund. But there will also be a review of the Adaptation Fund and its board. And so within the context of those discussions and negotiations, there is an opportunity to include language on innovative sources of climate finance, specifically highlighting things like fossil fuel reform levy and debt cancellation. However, my feeling is that, not feeling, but based on previous discussions on innovative sources of climate finance, within those discussions, the language gets potentially included at the start of a COP, and by the end of the COP, there are so many different compromises that take place that it's gone by the end, and you have sort of generic language such as from climate finance should be mobilized from all relevant sources. And so I think that's the kind of language that you would be able to expect and see there. At a global level, I'm not sure that countries are ready for a global innovative source of climate finance, but individually countries are starting to make those sorts of moves. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Laia. I saw a lot of nodding while you were speaking, but if any of the other speakers wants to come in on this question, please feel free. That doesn't seem to be the case at the moment. There was a third question raised from the audience around the ambition momentum created through the IPCC reports, and whether that is something that we actually feel is important, the voice of the science underpinning the urgency and the necessity for stepping up ambition. Now, Jean-Pascal has, of course, already left the round, but maybe one of you also wants to take up this question as the last one, as I think our time is then actually running out. Yes, Tom, please.
Yeah, I mean, I can quickly say a few words. I mean, I think, you know, the IPCC report's absolutely critical in terms of framing what COP's trying to achieve. I think it sets that, you know, that guide on how bad the situation is, how big the gaps are, and precisely what we actually need from governments to be able to close those gaps. You know, we know, I think, well, you can look at previous COPs where there's been, you know, difficulties over referencing the IPCC in the negotiations and actually making sure that there's a clear hook between the COPs and the IPCC. But I think that's definitely something that COP26 will have to do, is actually, you know, say, look, thanks IPCC for these reports. We're now aware of what's at stake. We're now aware of what we actually need to do. And that should set the context for all of the action across all of the pillars of the Paris Agreement on closing the mitigation gap, on getting the finance needed, on adaptation, loss and damage, sectoral transformation, finalizing the rule book. I think, you know, as I said in my remarks, we need COP26 to be that response to the IPCC's Code Red warning. That is the only way that we're going to have a COP that delivers what we need. So I think making that link is really clear. And I think that, you know, it's definitely something that negotiators and governments wake up to, and we need them to actually take it seriously and to really internalize every message of the IPCC in their response at COP. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. Selamawit, why don't you have the last input on this question?
Thank you. No, just to say, I hope that this time around we wouldn't see the IPCC report as political, and then we actually take it seriously. And another advantage that I see with this is that usually we don't have problems referring to UNFCCC reports. So it's a good timing that we have both the UNFCCC synthesis report and NDC, and that we have the IPCC report. So all the things that we could possibly refer to as an input for this conference are already there. And I really hope we wouldn't get into a political debate, but rather use this as an opportunity to actually deliver what needs to be delivered. And I think how I would wish that this COP to be different is that other times when we argue about this is political, we wouldn't want IPCC referred in this platform and so on. Maybe back then we did have more chance to do this, but like now we don't have any room. Like this COP needs to deliver on ambition, and I really hope that everyone steps on the same page when it comes to this, because if we miss this chance, chances are we're not going to get a chance like this again. I know we've been saying this for quite often, but this time around there wouldn't be a second chance where we would say again, if we miss this chance, if we miss it now, it's missed. So I really hope that we wouldn't get into not wanting to refer to IPCC, but I hope we would take at it holistically, both the IPCC report and the NDC synthesis report by the UNFCCC Secretariat. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Those were actually great closing words for our ambition discussion of the past 1.5 hours. Thanks a lot to you, and thanks a lot to all of the speakers. I think it was extremely rich, and I am personally very glad that we could open up the frame for ambition much more beyond mitigation and the 1.5 that are absolutely crucial, but also have a look at all the other aspects. So, well, I'm personally looking forward to meeting many of you in Glasgow in the coming days and weeks, and join hands and forces to make this high ambition package happening there. All the best to all of you there. And thanks a lot for our audience and the good questions. And I hope this discussion was meaningful to you as well. Thank you very much also to Ciel again for hosting us.